Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. As you can see, we have a guest with us today. This is Austin Fischer. Welcome to the program, Austin.
Great to be with you, Leighton. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is long overdue. I have meant to have you on the Soteriology 101 podcast since the very beginning because I know you wrote your book back about the time I was beginning the program, it seems. And I was always so thoroughly impressed with your writing ability. You are gifted in that. And I've always appreciated how kind you have been in your, I guess, controversial views with regard to Calvinism. You've always expressed yourself in such a way that has shown respect to those that you disagree with, and I appreciate that about you. I appreciate your own testimony. I appreciate your story. I've heard interviews with you so long over the years that there was a part of me that was like, well, if I have him on again, I have to ask him the basic same questions. But I think there's been enough time that has passed that I kind of wanted to get your perspective even now since the writing of the book, Young, Restless, and No Longer Reformed. And how long ago did you write that book, Austin?
Gosh, it would be 8, probably about 8 years ago at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that the title was a play off of what Colin Hansen's article on Young, Restless, and Reformed, where he's really talking about the resurging of Calvinism, and that whole Piperism is what some people call it. The rise of the Young, Restless, Reformed, and I know that that's part of your testimony. You were a part of that kind of surgence, as was I, maybe a decade or so before you, where we were influenced greatly by MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, later John Piper, Louis Giglio, who really brought John Piper into the mainstream. And those same folks were the ones that influenced me, I think, that influenced you. But just for those who may not be familiar with your story, give us a little background. Tell us maybe your story in and out of Calvinism and how that's influenced you.
Absolutely. And first off, just thanks for the kind words, man. I really do appreciate it. Colin's piece was a really seminal work. I grew up Baptist-ish. I had a Church of Christ father, a Methodist mother, and I think they met in the middle on Baptist. And I think, like most people, Calvinism for the average kind of Christian is not very intuitive. There are just some intuitive struggles that most people have with it. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying most people don't grow up naturally being Calvinist unless you're kind of explicitly taught it, Presbyterian, whatever it would be. And so when I got into high school, started taking my faith more seriously, and the guy who mentored me was a wonderful guy, still a dear friend, but he was a Calvinist, and slowly kind of started introducing me to people like John Piper. I mean, I still think I've read more books by John Piper than I have any Christian author. It was hard to catch up with all the Piper reading I did early on. And then, people like MacArthur and Sproul, and of course Louis, and then later Matt Chandler and some of those guys. And I didn't know it was Calvinism at the time, right? I just knew that it was, rigorous, thoughtful, passionate, and certainly, and we'll unpack this more, but biblical. You can make biblical arguments for this stuff, Christianity. Right. And so, as a young kid who was, in a world that felt very confusing, and, you're sorting through kind of early stages of postmodernism in some ways at that point, where everything feels like it's up in the air, there was something about Calvinism's really clinical, thought out, rigid structure that really appealed to me, and I think that's the appeal it had for a lot of people kind of in that time frame. Is there was the sense that things are kind of all up in the air. Things we used to think were settled are up in the air. And Calvinism provides this really stark, like, hey, here's where things go. And, God is the all-determining reality, and this means this and this means that. And, on down with all the systematic doctrines. And there was a place for everything, man. And that really appealed to me. And I have a pretty intuitively black and white mind. And so I just really, it struck a chord with me. And again, I didn't know it was Calvinism. I just knew, like, man, this feels like thorough, rigid in a healthy sense, like strong, firm Christianity. And so I went all in on it, again, read all the Piper I could get my hands on, man. He was my hero. I even remember, this is a fun little anecdote, applying for colleges. And I was going to go to Wheaton originally. And I knew somehow, I don't know how I knew this, but that John Piper's son, Barnabas, who's the same age as me, he was going to be going to Wheaton at the same time. And I was like, oh, what if I could bunk with John Piper's son? That would be unbelievable if that could happen. He was my hero, man. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of where I was at. And then got to college and was firmly, entrenched in Calvinism and loved it, and had a few hangups, but for the most part, I was all in. And it was really a slow process looking back. And this is where I know some Calvinists won't agree with this, but for me, it was the more that I understood Calvinism, the more problems I had with it. Of course, essentially, the real hang up that's kind of at the very bottom of Calvinism that you either have to make your peace with or not is that, if God's the all determining reality, then all means all. And I had a very consistent logical mind. And so if I was going to be a good Calvinist, I wanted to be all in, baby. I wasn't going to wimp out, when it was convenient.
Yeah.
I wanted to be all in. And, got to this place where I realized that all the great Calvinist thinkers, like the Mount Rushmore of and again, a lot of that's pre-Calvinist. It's unfair to call Augustine a Calvinist, but that group of thinkers, they all affirmed that in some way you have to affirm that God, has ordained, obviously some unto salvation and some to damnation, but more specifically, that God in some sense has ordained the fall, right? There's really no getting around that one, and all of them are clear on that. And so you end up getting to a place where you realize you have to affirm something like God has ordained that the overwhelming majority of humans who have ever existed will, burn forever in hell, or however you want to conceive of hell, be in hell forever, for sins that he ordained, and I think ordained is the word everybody could agree with, that they would commit. And not only that, but God in some sense desires this state of affairs, right? Because there's no reason why God could not have had it another way. God could have construed whatever will God wanted, but God desired that the overwhelming majority of humans would burn in hell forever for sins that he ordained they commit. And some Calvinists would probably quibble with some of that. But again, I think the most consistent and rigorous ones, the ones I respect the most, would all affirm that. So anyways, long story short, I got to a place where I realized that I had to sign off on that to be a consistent Calvinist. And that, for me, for various reasons, became a bridge too far biblically, theologically, and we can jump in any of that at any point you want. But it was for me, it was at that point where I most understood Calvinism, right, that I began to go, I'm not sure that this actually works and is the best way to make sense of what we see in Scripture, and I'm not sure if theology even becomes coherent if we believe that about God.
Yeah, well said. As is most of what you write, you have a really an art for putting things in a really clear, concise way. It's what I appreciate about your writing and your speaking, for that matter. And so, in your own journey, especially out of Calvinism, I know you've talked about one of the pictures that still resonates in my mind, at least from your book and from your interviews over the years that I've listened to, is that you give this imagery of a house, and you're in this Calvinistic house, and it's just everything's in the right order, and you're sitting and having coffee with Spurgeon and all the greats, and it's just a wonderful place, and you just hear this cry from the basement, so to speak, of the reprobate, and it's very similar to my journey. But you put it into a picture that I really related with, because that was kind of the thing that was always kind of gnawing on me behind the scenes as a Calvinist. When someone brought it up, I just like the doctrine of hell. I don't like the doctrine of hell even to this day. I still struggle with the doctrine of hell. I'm just being honest. When people bring up the doctrine of hell, I don't want to talk about it. I just don't, even from my perspective and what I believe about hell, because I don't like talking about things I can't grasp. I don't know how to deal with. And so I tend to bury it or tend to push it down. And I remember when the reprobate of the Calvinist, as a Calvinist, when that would come up, I would tamp it down. I would explain it away. I would quote a verse out of context. Now I know it's out of context, but I would quote a verse and move on. and or just say, well, you don't understand what we're saying, or something of that nature. And so tell us a little bit about how you wrestled with that when you heard the cry of the reprobate, so to speak. What was going through your mind? What made you not do what most Calvinists do and just tamp it down and move on and stay the party line?
That's a great question, and it's a great way to frame it. I think some of it is a personality thing where, like, my mind is just very, if this is what I am going to say, I believe, then I need to have integrity, right? Which just means like wholeness and consistency in my beliefs. And so if Calvinism requires the reprobate, and it does, then man, like, how can I just ignore the fact that, I mean, the way I've told some of my Calvinist friends, and I still have a lot of them, that Calvinism works great except for the reprobate. And the problem is the reprobate, and again, the overwhelming majority of humans who God has ordained would be in hell forever for sins God ordained and in some sense desired that they would commit. That's most humans. And so that's a pretty big deal. Like, we're not talking about some tiny little fine print. I mean, we're talking about a really horrific ending that God in some sense desires for most humans. And so it was really just feeling the weight of the fact that, hey, this is an enormous problem that I either need to make my peace with, or I need to start asking myself some questions about what it means that I have a huge problem with this. And I think most Christians do. I've even heard a lot of Calvinist leaders who, again, I respect over the years, but refer to the reprobate issue as kind of like, it's kind of like a family secret, that you don't want to bring up on the front end. You don't want to scare anybody away. You want to wait till they're in the fold, and then you show them the fine print. And I've just always felt like it was a little bit duplicitous to do that. And people need to know what they're signing up for when it comes to Calvinism. And in my opinion, consistent Calvinism requires you to sign up for a pretty firm and difficult doctrine of reprobation. And again, I think most of the best Calvinists are clear on that. And so for me, it just became this issue where I said, man, if I am indeed required to believe that God has ordained most people suffer in hell forever for sins he desired, ordained they commit, then in what sense is God good? I mean, that's the most basic question. Like, the word good is something that as Christians, we believe is ultimately fleshed out in Jesus Christ. Like, Jesus Christ shows us what goodness is. And so how do you reconcile this picture and this message that we find in Christ? God would rather die than give you what you deserve, right? And that's the good news of the gospel. God would rather die than give you what you deserve. But then you have to put this really big asterisk by that and say, for some of you, that's how God feels. But for most of you, God would actually prefer to have you burn in hell for sins that he ordained and desired that you would commit. And man, you just really have to do some wrangling to make sense of those two things. I think it's Piper who talks about how God has, very complicated emotions. And so understanding that's anthropomorphic language, but that God in some sense does feel real grief about the reprobate. I mean, and I think that's a fair way to put it. And again, that's very biblical. God shows grief. But it's just once you press down further on that, it's like, well, what is God like? Why does God have to grieve that? Like, things don't have to be that way. God doesn't have to ordain that most humans burn in hell forever for sins that he desired that they commit. And so surely you don't want to believe that hell is necessary, because if you believe hell is necessary, then you bump into all sorts of problems about creation being necessary, and you violate some very essential Christian doctrines very quickly. And so it just became this thing where, you're going, I don't know that these two things are compatible, that God would rather die than give humans what they deserve. That's what's revealed to us in Jesus Christ. And yet that's really, not only is that only part of the story, that's actually mostly not the story, because most of the story is God desires that most humans would burn in hell forever for sins that God desired that they would commit. And so just feeling the weight of that cognitive dissonance, man, is what started to pull me away from Calvinism. And I think continues to be the biggest struggle most people have once all the cards are laid out for them.
Well said. Well, I would like to allow you to interact a little bit with Kevin DeYoung's review of your book. And this is probably an 8-year-old review as well. I mean, this is a long time ago, which I know you've engaged with in the past. But the reason I wanted to do it on the program is because Kevin articulates, I think, in a fair way, things that I hear very regularly from Calvinists whenever they're confronting my views today. They're very common objections to those of us who object to Calvinism. And therefore, I think it could be beneficial to our audience to hear at least you and myself even engage with Kevin DeYoung, who is a leading Calvinistic scholar, who's very, very well respected among Calvinists. And he's fair. I mean, he starts off his book review giving you great praise for the same reason I do, that you're a very good writer, that the things you write are very clear. You are fair with Calvinists. Matter of fact, let me just put it into the screen if you don't mind.
Sure.
He even begins by saying, I believe Fischer has tried very hard to be fair with Calvinists, which is what I acknowledged every time I've heard you speak. You don't make ad hominem arguments, as he mentions there in the second sentence. He goes on to say he does not take cheap shots, which this is really valuable. The reason I point this out, guys, is that though I could be guilty at times of saying things I wish I would have worded differently against Calvinism, I've strived to the critique of many non-Calvinists, by the way, to be really fair with Calvinists and not to cry out heretic and scream them down and all these kinds of things, but also just not taking cheap shots, meaning the lowest hanging fruit of just calling them baby killers, for example, or these kinds of extreme examples, or taking the worst of the worst kind of Calvinist out there, like the Westboro Baptist kind of Calvinists that are holding up signs, let's kill the soldiers' babies or whatever, all these horrible things, and relating that to Calvinists. But instead, looking at the best of the best of Calvinists like DeYoung or Piper or others, and saying that this is a good representation of the Calvinists that we are familiar with, that we were under their teachings when we were Calvinist ourselves. So he acknowledges that you're not one who takes cheap shots. And he goes on to say, he says, but despite these good intentions, Fischer's arguments suffer from a lack of familiarity with the important distinctions frequently cited in the Reformed tradition. In other words, put in a nice way, he's saying, you just don't understand Calvinism, which is a common refrain. I hear it all the time. Leighton, you couldn't have possibly been a real Calvinist. It's impossible that you ever actually understood Reformed doctrine. That's something we hear quite regularly. And then he goes on to give an example of this. For example, Fischer suggests that Calvinists believe that when people are raped, maimed, murdered, and tortured, that God ultimately did those things to them. What's missing here is an awareness of the distinction between remote and primary causes. No Calvinist I know would say that God rapes people. God is never the doer of evil. What do you say to that?
Well, first off, I would just like to return the compliment and say that I think you are a very charitable Calvinist interlocutor. And that's important, especially in today's climate. And this is slightly afield of our discussion, but I think in the past few years, we've seen things continue to devolve when it comes to people learning how to charitably disagree and have conversations. And man, it's just, frankly, it ruins our witness when Christians are hateful and spiteful and make bad, unfair arguments with each other. And so I'm same as you. I've been guilty of it at many moments. It's a very natural human thing, to want to do that and to just want to win. But you really have to get to that place where you're not in this thing to win. Man, you're in it to bring clarity, and to understand Scripture and God better together. And you really have to believe that. And so, yeah, somebody like Kevin, this is never something we're going to see eye to eye on. But Kevin is a good man and a great pastor, and I'm glad he exists. And so I appreciate the things he said. To his point there, yeah, that is something I hear a lot is, the only way you could really walk away from Calvinism is if you didn't actually understand it. And, it's a little patronizing, but that's where I just try to push back and say, no, I really do think that I walked away because I did understand it. Right? And I'm not saying that anybody who understands it has to walk away, but I'm just saying, oh man, believe it or not, people can understand Calvinism and still walk away, and actually walk away because they understood it. Right? Reasonable people can disagree on this. And so his general point in that specific one, and gosh, I don't even remember specifically what he's referring to. I would never say that a Calvinist has to believe God raped somebody. I would never in a million years say that. He's drawing a distinction there, drawing attention to obviously the primary and secondary causes bit. And again, for me, I don't mean to circumvent some of that, but like when it comes to the mechanics of how God, goes about enacting God's sovereignty, personally, that's not something I find particularly interesting or helpful to even sort through. I mean, so like he can talk about primary and secondary causes. Piper talks, you got like the permissive will versus, gosh, it's been so long since I've gone over it. Will, the decrees. None of that's particularly interesting to me because it's beside the point. How God goes about being sovereign is not interesting to me, nor could we ever answer it. To me, it's about intention and desire. And so however we explain the mechanics of how God goes about being sovereign, yeah, at the end of the day, in a determinist system, things happen because God desires that they happen and ensures, and that's where I think ordains is the right word, that certain things do happen. God ensures that whatever does happen is, again, what God wanted to happen because God's will is ultimately determinative in every situation. And so I've just never found the kind of back and forth about did God did this, did humans do that? It's not interesting to me, and we can't really answer it anyways. Of course, primary and secondary causes, I would agree with DeYoung about all that. I would just say that at the end of the day, a Calvinist is theologically obligated to affirm that God being sovereign over all things means all things. And it really is as simple as that.
Well, as the quote we've read before quite regularly on Desiring God website, written by Mark Talbert, who is edited by John Piper.
He's great. Yeah, Talbert's great.
It's on his site. So, I mean, this is still here. And this is the way they put it. God brings about. So the word maybe brings about is a better word than ordains even, maybe, I don't know. But he brings about all things in accordance with his will. In other words, it isn't just that God manages to turn the evil aspects of our world to good for those who love him. So that's an explicit denunciation of him turning that which is done by evil creatures and making them or redeeming them for good, which would be, I think, our perspective. But they come out right out and deny that that's what God's doing. And they even go on to say it is rather that he himself brings about these evil aspects for his glory and his people's good. This includes, and I'm still quoting here, this includes, as incredible and unacceptable as it may currently seem, having even brought about the Nazis' brutality at Birkenwald and Auschwitz, as well as the terrible killings of Dennis Rader and even the sexual abuse of a young child. So I know the example of rape was used by DeYoung there, and that does sound detestable. But even leading Calvinistic scholars are saying that God brings about, i.e. sees to it that, that's another phrase that Piper uses in his book called Providence. God sees to it that there's sexual abuse of young children for his own glory. There's rape, there's murder for his own glory. And this is what we're, I guess, trying to push back on. DeYoung may not like the way in which one person articulates it versus another, but to call us, say that we're all misrepresenting the swath of Calvinistic scholarship out there seems to be unfair in my estimation. What do you think?
Yeah. And again, I'm not even sure exactly what he's referring to at that part in the book. But again, I would never, and I think it would be wrong if I did say, a Calvinist is obligated to believe God. I mean, it feels weird to even say it rapes people. Like, of course, I mean, that's atrocious, not at all. But a Calvinist is theologically obligated to affirm what I think Talbert's a great example of a very rigorous and consistent Calvinist. I mean, I really appreciate his work because he doesn't dodge, like he accepts what he needs to accept. And so whether it brings it about, Roger Olson, who was a friend of mine and a great Arminian scholar, he uses the phrase renders certain, right? So God renders certain, and I think that's a good way to put it. Most Calvinists are okay with that. That evil happens for his glory. And so, again, it's not a matter of, and there are some people who make sloppy arguments that say, oh, Calvinists say God did this, did that. No, there are very complicated and thoughtful explanations for how God goes about exercising God's sovereignty. But at the end of the day, God is the all determining reality, and all includes all. Edwards, explains it, I think, the best it can be explained in terms of desires. Right. And that's where some of the compatibilism stuff comes in. God, in some sense, determines our desires. And in determining our desires, God has, in some sense, determined what we will do. And so and again, I think Edwards does the best job explaining that. But Edwards affirms that God determines our desires. and hence
Yeah.
determines what humans will do. Though, of course, compatibilism, we are free so long as we are doing what we want to. And that was Edwards' genius. And that's why he kind of went the route of God determining our desires.
Yeah. And when you redefine free will to mean doing what you want, which means it doesn't mean much if what you want is determined by somebody outside yourself. And that's where we would call that form of free will an illusion, which really gets to what he brings up in his article. The next paragraph, DeYoung writes, likewise, Fischer assumes several times that in Reformed theology, the human will is only an illusion. The picture painted is of God who makes sure people do what he wants rather than will to do so or not. So God, according to Fischer's version of Reformed theology, must put the impulse to sin inside Adam. In his chapter on kingdom discipleship, Fischer argues that Calvinism cannot naturally produce discipleship because at the heart of being a disciple is making a choice to follow Jesus. And in Calvinism, you simply do not have a choice and therefore do not have a will that matters, end quote. What do you say to that?
I mean, this is, the basic determinism argument. And so, compatibilism versus, and I don't know that libertarian free will is the right word, but something like that. And so this is just a moment, I think, in Kevin's review where I think he could have done better, and that I painstakingly talk about compatibilism and I think explain that I understand compatibilism. And so it's not that I've made an ad hominem, argument about Calvinism when it comes to God making people do things. It's that I reject compatibilism as a viable definition of free will. And so I just think he should have been clearer about what was going on there. He pulled some things out of context that don't even mention compatibilism or an explanation of them, at least not in this section. And so, of course, if you buy into compatibilist freedom, where you're free so long as you do what you want, Calvinism allows for free will. But I do not think that most people would sign off on a compatibilistic definition of free will.
Right. And even Piper, in his most recent interviews with, over his book Providence, comes right out and says men do not have free will in the libertarian sense of the word. They have, compatibilistic free will, which again is just a simple way of saying they do what they want, but what they want is determined by their maker ultimately. And that's what we're calling illusionary. In other words, it's just an illusion to call that free will, because anytime somebody is controlling your desires, which is controlling, therefore, your choices, then that's no form of free will as far as we can tell. And I think that's pretty intuitive.
Well, and that's where I just think it's deceptive grammar. Like if you say free will, I mean, I think free will is a word that has a certain connotation of meanings that most humans understand. And when you've imported a definition of free will that's not only different, but is kind of the exact opposite of what the word tends to mean, I think it is incumbent upon you to explain that. And I think that's one area where we're Calvinists. And again, I get it, but just haven't been as forward as they probably could and should have been when it comes to that. And we should probably also just briefly point out that, like, Calvinism, in its relationship to the Reformed tradition, is a little bit more complicated than most people realize. And I even, looking back, if there was anything that I could do over, it is I would have spent more time explaining that when I say I'm no longer Reformed, in the title, and I mentioned this in a footnote, but I should have spent more time in it. Reform there means mostly this kind of modern, primarily American version of Calvinism that is most exemplified in people like, John Piper and all those folks. But certainly the Reformed tradition is not simply reducible to those people, and they would not be representative of what a lot of the Reformed tradition is. We don't really have to chase that rabbit, but I do think it's helpful for people to know that. And that's a criticism that was leveled that I think was fair. And I think I should have probably spent more time explaining, that the Reformed tradition is a diverse thing.
Yeah, I think Olson even has a little article that he's written on how even Arminians are Reformed, and that we were Reformed from the Catholic Church, and so that and the fact that you mentioned that in a footnote, I think people knew that the title was a playoff of the popular the phrase of Young, Restless, and Reformed, and so I think most people who knew what you were talking about understood that. But I can.
Some people don't read the footnotes, Leighton. That's what I've learned, man.
What?
Yeah, it's a shocker. Big shocker.
Read the fine print. Always read the fine print before you buy. Well, he goes on to write this. He goes, he says, Fischer also describes reprobation in terms that are more extreme than even a super-lapsarian Calvinist would use. All of them? Really? Are you sure? Have you listened to all of them, DeYoung? Just saying, brother. Have you listened to all of them? Because I promise you,
I don't know if he's
Austin
listened to some of his
Fischer,
buddies preach.
I don't know if he's listened to some of the extreme superlapsarian Calvinists that I've listened to, but I'm not sure if he should use such sweeping terms as this. But while he is right to insist, DeYoung says, while he's right to insist that Calvinists own up to double predestination, his description of the position, i.e. God creates people in order to damn them, is not how Reformed theologians have explained reprobation. Now, wait, just 1 second there. Okay. Your statement is God creates people in order to damn them. And he's saying that's not how Reformed theologians have explained reprobation. Excuse me real quick, Austin. I have to do this. Here is John Calvin. I would consider him a reformer, right? I would consider him a Calvinist. Is Calvinist?
Yeah, he's on Mount Rushmore there.
Okay, all right. Okay, he wrote, we call predestination God's eternal decree by which he compacted with himself what he willed to become of each man. For all are not created, he even uses the word created. All are not created in equal condition. Rather, eternal life is foreordained for some, eternal damnation for others, end quote. Do you think DeYoung would sign off on that statement by John Calvin, since it's coming from John Calvin, while accusing you of not understanding Calvinism when you virtually said the exact same thing?
Yeah, I assume he would agree with Calvin. There is a little bit of wiggle room there in Calvin's quote, just in that it doesn't touch the fall, and so again, what most Calvinists do is when it comes to the positive side of predestination, right? So predestination unto salvation. Mm-hmm. God's action is explained in very aggressive, actionable terms. God doesn't wait for your decision. God sovereignly elects certain people unto salvation. So it's very aggressive, active language. But when it comes to the decree of reprobation, right? So that second part of double predestination, all of a sudden the language about God's action gets very passive, right? And DeYoung uses it there. God passes over certain people. Idea being, you've got this huge group of damned humanity, right? Everybody deserves hell. And then God graciously and actively chooses some for salvation. And then the rest of them, God passes over them and lets them get what they deserve. Right. And that, there's some qualms you could still have with that. But that, I get it. And that works. But again, the problem, and Calvin was very clear on this. I don't have the quote in front of me. I'll find it. But Calvin's very clear that God ordained the fall. Okay. And so you can't just jump to, you got this damned mass of humans who God can then sovereignly save some and pass over others and they get what they want. No, God, then there's just no way around this. God in some sense ordained, desired, I don't think we can get away from desired, the fall. And so that's where I think DeYoung right there and many Calvinists don't quite bite the bullet, is they jump to this huge damned mass of humanity that God is then free to do what he wants with. And they skip over God in some sense ordaining the fall. And that gets to the infra and supra lapsarianism. But again, I think most of the leading Calvinist Augustinian thinkers understood that you needed to affirm that God ordained and desired even the fall.
Well, and I'll put it up on the screen. I was able to find it there. Well, even at the bottom of the screen, you can see it says salvation is freely offered to some while it's barred from access to others. So that doesn't sound like he's just passing them by. It sounds like he's actually barring them from access, at least according to that quote. Here's another quote from Calvin. Again, I ask, whence does it happen that Adam's fall irremediably involved so many peoples together with their infant offspring in eternal death, unless because it so pleased God? The decree is dreadful indeed, I confess. Yet no one can deny that God foreknew what the end man was to have before he created him, and consequently foreknew because he so ordained it by his decree. And it ought not seem absurd for me to say that God not only foresaw the fall of the first man, and in him the ruin of his descendants, but also meted it out in accordance with his own decision. end quote.
Yeah, that's the quote.
And, yeah, that's the one. Well, and there's other ones that are more direct even than that one, if I can find it here. Man's fall according to God's providence ordains, but he falls by his own fault. So it's according to the providence and ordaining it, but yet still Adam's at fault. In other words, he's held responsible for what God has decreed for him to do, which is what the mystery of the entire system entails. And then here's another one. The first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet that he should, end quote. And so you really can't get away from just that blatant claim of at least John Calvin and his form of Calvinism, if no one else.
No, I completely agree. And I've had a number of conversations with, again, good, thoughtful Calvinist people who want to deny God ordaining the fall. And I just always push them and say, look, it is incumbent upon you to explain how you can deny that, because, again, most all the greatest Augustinian Calvinist thinkers did affirm it because they saw that's where the logic necessarily led, and they had enough theological integrity to not bail out at that moment.
Right. Yeah. Well, he goes on, and again, he talks about that a little bit longer, but he goes on to bring this critique: have the problems with Arminianism been squarely faced? Is the next critique that he brings. He writes this. He says, the most effective aspect of no longer reformed is how Fischer forces us to stare at the doctrine of reprobation and consider whether this is a picture of God we can live with. There is no doubt that double predestination is a tough pill to swallow, and that reprobation can feel like a horrible decree, to use Calvin's phrase. I think in the end, the best thing the Calvinist can say is, who are we to talk back to God? Romans 9:20. And who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Romans 11:34. Fischer eventually comes to find this response untenable. For my part, I resonate with Bavinck's appeal that Calvinism, quote, invites us to rest in him who lives in unapproachable light, whose judgments are researchable, and whose paths are beyond tracing out, end quote. What do you say to that?
Yeah, the Romans 9 and 11, that whole deal is certainly very interesting. As to the specific question of, whether or not all the problems with Arminianism have been squared, that's a really interesting one, where neither in the book nor ever have I specifically identified as an Arminian. I'm not saying that I'm not. I probably in some ways am, but I think some of the Arminian Calvinism arguments, they were predicated on much later theological conflicts about soteriology, which is obviously fitting for this particular podcast. But the basic distinction that I'm trying to draw attention to in the book, because it was the one at the heart of my journey, is really not about soteriology, strictly speaking, but it's about who God is. And of course, soteriology is a result of that. But it's my conviction that the majority classical Christian consensus involves something like free will. I don't know if libertarian is the right word, because it's not like we can just choose whatever we want and there are no constraints upon our will. No, but some form of real created freedom is something God granted to humans in creating us in his own image. I don't think that some version of freedom is incoherent, right? There are some scholars who think free will itself is incoherent. But if we are to affirm that God has free will, and I think we have to, then clearly the idea of free will isn't incoherent, even if we struggle to understand exactly how it works. We have a free will that is in some sense analogous to God's free will. The Arminian piece, there are questions, and I freely admit there are pieces in it that are difficult. Like, what causes someone, like what pushes you over the edge to choose or not choose to follow Christ? I don't know how anyone could possibly answer that question. It's not answerable to me. And so every theological system has its struggles, but it's certainly my conviction that the struggles and mysteries that you have to live with, and what I would just call classical theism, of which Arminianism is a later expression, they're like proper biblical mysteries, and not mysteries that call into question whether or not Jesus Christ is the exhaustive revelation of God or not. And that's what you bump into with Calvinism. Is Jesus really the whole story? And I don't think Calvinists can affirm that Jesus is the whole story. Jesus is a part of the story, but behind Jesus, there's this hidden God who is kind of the exact opposite of Christ, a hidden God who, and again, I don't think you can get away from this language, in some sense desires that most people would end up in hell or tortured forever or annihilated or, whatever the case may be.
Well, and the mystery that you appealed to with regard to free will is not a mystery that's uncommon even among Reformed theologians, because when it comes to Adam and Eve, we have, for example, R.C. Sproul, who has said this, but Adam and Eve were not created fallen. They had no sin nature. They were good creatures with a free will, yet they chose to sin. Why? I don't know, nor have I found anyone else that does know. So
has he read Calvin?
Yeah, because God ordained
Calvin
it is the
knows.
answer for the right Calvinist. Yeah. And so he's appealing to the mystery of the first choice because he can't blame it on the fall in nature, i.e. the desired will that's constrained by the bondage of the fall. And so he doesn't have a reason as to why Adam and Eve chose to sin, except to appeal to mystery. And that's the same mystery where we think the Bible affords with regard to every choice that we make that's a moral choice that's free. The cause of a choice is the chooser. The cause of a determination is the determiner. Why did God choose to create when he could have not created? We don't know. I mean, we just know that he determined that. Well, why do I choose to follow Christ and my neighbor doesn't choose to follow Christ? That's why I'm responsible for that, because it's my choice. I'm the determiner of that. And that's where I think the mystery should rest, is right there on that point. And I think we should leave it at that instead of projecting onto the scriptures philosophical nonsense, I think, and begin to say, okay, a deterministic answer must be required here, begging the question. And we must answer the question, what determined for that free agent to do what he did? Because it couldn't have been the free agent, therefore undermining what free will is all about. Don't you think?
No, I agree. And again, what's so ironic about Sproul's quote here is, I mean, I could sign off 100% on that. I just don't think I don't think he can say that. Again, having just read the Calvin quote, that's why Calvin was the best Calvinist, man, is he was very consistent and he wasn't afraid to bite the bullet. And so when Sproul says something like that, I want to stand up and applaud and agree, but then just say, but you can't really say that. It's not consistent for you to say that.
Yeah, and let's go back to the Romans 9:20, because this is another common refrain, and you mentioned it. That was interesting that he quoted from 9 and 11, and I know why, because I know what your interpretation of Romans 9 through 11 is. But at the same time, this is something that I know our audience and people who are engaging with Calvinists on a regular basis, they hear this a lot, is when you object to the claims of a Calvinist, you will hear, "Who are you, O man, to talk back to God?" Maybe they should say, "Who are you, O man, to talk back to Calvinism?" But ultimately, because
sometimes it's hard to distinguish.
Yes, it is. And so when they say, "Who are you to talk back to God?" they are obviously pulling Romans 9, in our estimation, out of context and applying their theological view onto the text. And thus, when you question this concept and idea that God has created some for salvation and some for reprobation, and you bring an objection to that, then on your view, Austin, why is it wrong for them to quote Romans 9:20 and just say, "Who are you to question that God creates some for salvation and some for damnation?"
Yeah, part of the struggle always is when people, kind of pull that. And again, and I get it. And there's not nothing there. That's a Texas way to say it. There's not nothing there. There is something there. But a lot of times it's important to distinguish, like, hey, I'm not questioning God. Let's be clear, buddy. I'm questioning you. And I'm questioning whether or not you have God right. The whole questioning God thing, it is really interesting. Like the book of Job is so helpful here, where, the book of Job is this really interesting theological debate that was clearly going on in the Jewish community, where you had people who said, hey, man, this is just, it is what it is, and God does what he wants, and who are you to question God? And obviously Job's like, well, I'm going to do it. So here's what it is, because I have some questions about how things were handled. And in my opinion, the whole book of Job, like, why was it included in the Bible? You have to ask yourself that question. I think clearly Job was included in the Bible because the Christian Jewish tradition has a very important place for humans questioning God, wrestling with God, asking questions. And so I don't think God is in any sense insulted or belittled by us daring to ask some pretty basic questions about God's call and God's goodness and the way God's revealed himself. And so I hate when that's used to shut down dialogue, because that's usually what it is. You push a Calvinist into a corner, and you start asking them to just really think through some of these difficult questions about the reprobate. And then it's the, hey, who are you? Romans 9, who are you to talk to God? And I go, well, you ought to read Job. There's actually a lot that we can say about God. But even more to the point, I think it's most important to distinguish that when I say I have a problem with the idea that God would, create most humans so that they could be damned forever. I'm not basing that on because God owes us humans, eternity and good things. It has nothing to do with us. Okay. It has everything to do with who God is. Okay. So I don't think God would do that because I don't think Scripture portrays God as a God who would delight in doing that. I think in Jesus Christ, we're shown that God is the exact opposite of that God is a God who would rather die than give people what they deserve. All that to say, my complaint is not humanistic in that sense. It's not rooted in humans owe better. It's Christocentric. It's revealed in God has showed us that God is better than that, right? Not because I said so or I'm owed something, but because God is who Jesus Christ revealed God to be fully and completely, and there's no hidden God behind Jesus Christ.
Oh, that's well said. And I always have to push back on Calvinists when they bring up Romans 9 out of context and say, who are you to question God? Who is that interlocutor that Paul is anticipating in his mind? Is it, as we believe, the same interlocutor that he brought up in Romans chapter 3, who is saying, if my unrighteousness brings about your glory, then why am I still to be blamed? And that's a Jew who's saying, if me crying out, crucify him, if you raising me up for the very purpose of displaying your wrath on me as a hardened, self-righteous Jew, if that's a part of your plan of redemption to bring about your own righteousness and your own glory, then who are you to bring condemnation and wrath on me because I'm serving your purpose? If you understand that's the interlocutor, then Calvinism has no basis. It has no apologetic. It has no defense, because the interlocutor, if Calvinism is true, has to be a first century Arminian synergist, quote unquote, objecting to the concept of double reprobation or double predestination. And if it's not that interlocutor, if it's actually a Jew who's objecting to God hardening his own chosen people and engrafting the Gentile peoples, if that's really what he's addressing, then Calvinism has no defense. And that's what seems so strange for very intelligent people like DeYoung, I know is, like Piper, I know is. These are very intelligent people. For them not to see that seemingly basic concept to me, I mean, I understand we were both like in our teens when we became Calvinists. I understand why we didn't see it at the lack of education that we have. But now that I've actually studied these things and I've looked at First Temple Judaism and the N.T. Wright kind of materials, I'm just like, how can people not see and at least acknowledge, even if they don't come to agree with it, at least acknowledge that there is a strong, robust exegetical understanding of Romans 9 through 11 that does not involve double predestination, this reprobation concept that is damning most people to an eternal hell for reasons beyond their control. Have you grappled with that any more than I have, possibly?
Well, what's hard is to avoid the temptation to, psychologize others. And so I try to not do that. But I do think that, like, fundamentally, and I wrote about this in my second book, that, when it comes to Scripture, and let's just say this general idea of God's sovereignty and how it works, I think you can pile up proof text for both sides of it. There are good biblical arguments to be made for something like Calvinism, just like there are good biblical arguments to be made for what I would call classical theism. And so what you end up having to do is just go, okay, you got these two basic, let's say lenses you could put on and read all Scripture through this lens or that lens. And you have to make a determination about which one of those lenses you think is right. And if you've landed on, the determinism lens, then yeah, everything gets filtered through that grid and you lean that way in every interpretation. And I get that. I just think it's the wrong lens to have on. I think Romans 9 is a good example of that. To your point, and I think I'll just add to what you said because I think it's really good. Romans 9 through 11, it's not like Paul gets to the end of Romans and he's like, I'm going to do a little theological treatise here on double predestination just to make sure that it's clear for everybody.
Yeah.
No, Paul is deeply grieved by this issue of why most Jews have rejected Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. right? That's Paul's fundamental struggle in a lot of ways. It comes through in so many of his letters. We don't understand it because it's not an issue that is remotely relevant to most of us. But that's what Romans 9 through 11 is meant to answer. Why have so many Jews rejected the Jewish Messiah, Jesus? And so Paul goes through this argument kind of explaining it. And for me, the simplest kind of piece to pull out of that is, who are these people? Who is Esau? Who are the branch that's been broken off? Like, who are the quote unquote reprobate people in Paul's scenario here? Well, it's these Jews who have rejected Jesus. And if you follow the argument all the way through to Romans 11, what happens to Esau? What happens to the branch that was broken off? What happens to these Jews who have rejected Jesus? Well, that's when you get this really universal language of, man, they've been broken off, but they're going to be grafted back in, and God shut up all in disobedience so that God may have mercy on all, And so, you don't have to go, David Bentley Hart's route there necessarily with the universalism, but it certainly leans in the direction of, this is not, whoever the reprobate people are, whoever Esau is, there's some redemptive purpose of God that is going to work to find a way to weave them back in. And that's the last word we get on those people. Not they've been broken off forever, they've been hardened forever. It's no, they've been shut up in their own disobedience so that God could find mercy on all. And God's going to find a way and give them every opportunity to be grafted back in.
Very well said. Why does Paul hold out hope for those hardened, that they may be grafted back in if they're the reprobate of Calvinism? There is no hope for a reprobate on Calvinism. Therefore, why would Paul go to the effort to say they've stumbled but not beyond recovery? I hope that my own ministry to the Gentiles will provoke them to envy so that they too may be saved, in the hopes that they leave their unbelief so as to be grafted back in. That none of those are even possible if they're reprobates. And so, at least in the mind of Paul, we can know that they weren't Calvinistic reprobates, and therefore that should be enough not to interpret it that way. Zach points out something that I didn't draw the conclusion of earlier, and I think it's important to notice that neither of us mentioned that DeYoung completely misrepresented Austin's point when he went from desiring the rape to God raping someone all in one paragraph, blatant strawman. And so he accuses us of you of strawmanning, but in reality, you talked about how God desired it on some level of desire, rape to happen. And then he accuses you of saying that God actually commits the rape. And of course, that's why you recoiled at that accusation. Why? Because it literally was a strawman accusation.
Yeah, well, and that's where, again, I think Kevin mostly did a really good job, and I certainly have not always been fair. But yeah, it's moments like that where you just, you do grieve a little bit that, I feel like, I'll put it this way. I feel like I read Calvin more closely and charitably than DeYoung has read me. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, and that's a really good way of doing it. Is to say, let's have the same standard for both sides here. When people critique me for not being fair to Calvinist or not, representing Calvinism well, I just say, okay, well, bring me a leading Calvinistic scholar who has done as much as I have done to represent the other side. In other words, show me where the Matt Chandlers and the John Pipers and the MacArthurs and the Sproul's of the world have had Calvinists in person non-Calvinists with them in person, leading scholars, instead of representing us as God getting into a DeLorean and traveling into the future, as Matt Chandler did, or as MacArthur did, saying that Arminians believe that we are the initiators in our salvation and that we take the first step to God, and basically describe them as full-on rank Pelagians and all these kinds of things. These are the kinds of things that they're doing on stages in large conferences without anybody having any kind of a stage or a platform for rebuttal. At least I have the leading scholars on the program at playing them for themselves, looking at the confessions for themselves. And until you can find me a leading Calvinist who's at least doing as much as I am to try to represent them, then that's going to fall, I think, virtually on deaf ears, because you've got to try to be generous with the other side as much as possible. But we all fall short, of course.
Oh, sure. And there are some who do it better than others. I mean, one Calvinist who I really respect and appreciate, though I disagree with, is Tim Keller. I mean, and Keller's not perfect, but man, Tim Keller is one reasonable, thoughtful, charitable person. And I would hold him up. And like in my church, man, I'll recommend Tim Keller books to people. It doesn't bother me at all, because Keller's fair. And he's thorough, and he doesn't put up straw men.
A little inconsistent, but yes, all those other things.
Certainly. But Keller's a good one. He really is.
Yeah, and that's when somebody tells, and I ask them who they read that their favorite is a Calvinist, and they tell me Keller, I will oftentimes, me too. I mean, he's my favorite Calvinistic author as well and speaker, because usually when he talks, he uses our vernacular, and he explains things. We were talking about hell earlier. His discourse on hell was really good, and it didn't seem at all consistent with what Calvinists teach with that regard. But I actually appreciated a lot of what he had to say when questioned about the doctrine of hell. And so, anyway, that's a good point as well. We're not going to go too much longer here. I want to try to bring this to a close here at the hour mark if we can. But I did want to mention one other part of DeYoung's critique of your book. He says this: Fischer's tendency to hover about the text makes for a series of definite statements that are much less than meets the eye. He consistently reminds us that at the center of the universe is not some glory-seeking God, but the mangled lamb of Revelation 5, as if Revelation 4 and the vision of him who sits on the throne receiving unceasing worship has nothing to do with God's purpose in glorifying God. Fischer makes much of the fact that in Jesus we see a desire to love at all costs, not a desire to glorify himself at all costs, as if the high priestly prayer in John 17 was not chiefly concerned with the glory of the Father and the Son. Fischer uses the story of Jacob wrestling with God as evidence that good theology always has doubts and uncertainty, because when you come face to face with God, you walk with a limp. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kevin in some places here has hovered above my text the way he has accused me of hovering above the biblical text. It is true that, I mean, I don't attempt in my book to do the whole, chapter exegesis of every verse related to everything Calvinism. That just wasn't the book I tried to write. That book's been written. There's good ones on it. And that wasn't the book I tried to write. I tried to pick out texts I felt were relevant, and again, spend a whole chapter on Romans 9 through 11. So I think it's a little unfair. But certainly to frame it more in terms of, general paradigms we see in Scripture is certainly the approach I took more in my book. That's just a thing where when people, you've probably dealt with this before, sometimes people complain that you didn't write like the book they thought you should write. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, guilty as charged. Yeah, I didn't write another book detailing every text because it's been written 1,000 times. I wrote the book that I wrote, and I think it's not the be all and end all book about why someone shouldn't be a Calvinist. It is one piece of that conversation that I think has been helpful for a lot of people.
Well, DeYoung hints to the black hole issue that you bring up. In fact, let me read this little section. It says, you had written, does the God of Calvinism accurately depict the God revealed in Jesus? The answer is a resounding no. Jesus shows us as a crucified for sinners God, while Calvinism gives us a creates sinners in order to crucify them God. Therefore, we cannot accept the predestinating Calvinist God whose chief end is to glorify himself because, quote, at the center of the universe, there is not a black hole of deity endlessly collapsing in on itself, but a suffering, crucified, mangled lamb endlessly giving away self. And this is one of the beautiful depictions, I think, that we find in your book, where you talk about the black hole of glory and you talk about the mangled lamb represented by Christ. Talk about that as we close our discussion together, because I think that's so vital to understanding the distinctions between, I think, what you now hold to and what you once held to in Calvinism.
I was probably 3/4 of the way done with the book when I'm a nerd, so it was some Nat Geo show about stars and black holes, and it just kind of hit me. I went, this is a really helpful way, I think, to frame the way Calvinism, the way God is construed in Calvinism, that God is this, just as a black hole. I won't nerd out here on black holes, but it's this infinite collapse in on self, on matter in a black hole. And in Calvinism, I think that's the picture we get of God. God is, the ultimate inward singularity who was fundamentally always concerned with God's self. Now, what needs to be pointed out here is that Calvinists would say, yes, that is true, and that is for our good. Right. So God is ultimately all about God's own glory, which is for our good. And that works so long as you don't talk about the reprobate. But
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
does God, how is this good for the reprobate? Which again is most humans who have ever existed. And so once you again insert that into the equation, I do think that the God of Calvinism, consistently construed, ends up being what I call the black hole of self. At the end of the day, ultimately concerned with self. And this is not for the good of most humans. It is for the eternal destruction of most humans. And I think a healthy way to contrast that is with this image we get in Revelation 5 of God not being this infinite inward collapse, but God being infinite outward giving, love, generosity. So that, again, the flow of God's movement is not infinitely in, but it is infinitely out. And that's a really simple thing, but for me, it's a very compelling image that I think does much more justice to what we see in Scripture. And again, the reason I don't believe that God is all about His glory and our greatest good, I don't think it works, even though it's a very clever way to put it, is because of the reprobate. It can't make sense of the reprobate.
Yeah. And I often point to the fact that the climactic event in all of human history, even by Calvinist own estimation, is the cross. And it is not depicting God as controlling of enemies. It's not depicting of God meticulously micromanaging everything that happens. It's not depicting anything that Calvinism sees as what is power and glory. What does it depict? It depicts weakness. It depicts self-sacrifice. It depicts love. It depicts giving up of oneself for the sake of another. It depicts giving up one's glory for the sake of those who don't deserve it. That's what it depicts. And therefore, that's what Christianity should depict as the primary and I think foundational point of our theology, and our soteriology should be about self-sacrifice, not self-seeking. The fact that Paul even defines love as that which does not seek its own, and God is called love, should tell us something about the fact that, yes, it's all about God's glory, but how is God most glorified? In the depiction of controlling his enemies, or the depiction of loving his enemies self-sacrificially by willing to die for them? And I think your book is masterful at really capturing the fact that our soteriology is, yes, man-centered, and that it's centered on the man Jesus Christ. It's Christocentric. And one of the side chat, and I promise I won't keep you too long here, but
it's all good.
Irresistible Truth is one of our Calvinist interlocutors on the side chat often who joins us. He says, does Austin forget about the God of the Old Testament? It's like he believes God changed once the 400 years of silence ended. Do you want to answer, Derek? His name's Derek. Do you want to answer Derek there?
Hi, Derek. It's a pretty broad, I'm not completely clear what he's referring to. If he's referring to the fact that God, is not afraid to be rowdy and pour out wrath and yada, yada, yada. I know I haven't forgotten any of those things.
Did you just yada, yada, yada wrath?
Yada, 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 wrath. Yeah, God is wrathful. But one of the things I tease out, I don't remember if it's the first book or the second book, is that wrath is ultimately just an expression of God's love, right? The wrath of God is what the love of God looks like when sinful humanity stands in opposition to it. And so God's wrath is not something other than God's love. It's just what God's love looks like for recalcitrant humanity. And to separate the wrath of God and love of God, you get into all sorts of really bad problems there. Like if you believe that wrath is some attribute of God separate from the love of God, then you bump into all sorts of problems about, well, then can wrath ever be exhibited or demonstrated if nothing besides God, if only God exists? Right? Because God can't show wrath if only God exists. God needs something to show wrath to. Well, if God needs to demonstrate God's full glory, which is typically a Calvinist kind of perspective, then God needs to create in order to demonstrate his wrath. Obviously, you don't want to go down this road because you cannot in any sense imply that creation was necessary. Edwards kind of dealt with this, and it's unclear how he avoided the charge that creation was necessary because God needs to display his full glory, wrath being one part of that. So I'm gone far afield here, but God's wrath is an expression of God's love. None of the Old Testament stuff is in any way, I think, difficult for what classical theism has always affirmed.
Well said, and I agree totally with what you're talking about. The fact that God does pour out wrath, I love what you said there, that in order for God to pour out wrath, there has to be something other than himself to pour out wrath upon. And if everything is from God, i.e. in accordance with what he has sovereignly and unchangeably decreed to happen, then he's pouring out wrath on that which he's decreed to happen, which again, that is the mystery of the entire Calvinistic system: is how is God good? I mean, how can we measure what goodness even in character even looks like on that kind of worldview, where his black is our white and our white is his black, as C.S. Lewis puts it?
Yep. No, Lewis says that so well, because it's not just an issue of, Calvinists have this robust, firm biblical view of God, and then everyone else is wimpy and sentimental with God. It's no. Let's get clear here. Scripture clearly teaches the wrath of God. I have no problem having a place in my theology for the wrath of God. It's necessary. But we need to be clear that the wrath of God is ultimately the love of God. And that, the problem in Calvinism is not that God's, not as soft as we modern people would like. It's that God does what appears to us, at least, to be the most horrific thing any mind could ever comprehend, which is create humans in order to damn them forever for his glory.
Yeah. One other quick, I keep saying we're ending it, but I'm a preacher. So, I always say I'm ending and then go on for another 10 minutes or so. So real quick here, I did recall in your testimony that, I don't know if it's still true there in your church in the Belton area, that you are a co-pastor, or that you pastor with someone who doesn't agree with you on this particular doctrine. Is that correct?
It is correct. So we have two lead pastors at my church. I'm one of them. And our other lead pastor is a Calvinist. He is what I lovingly refer to as a very inconsistent Calvinist, which means he just feels bad about certain parts of it. Yeah, he just feels bad. I'm glad he feels bad about it. Yeah. No, and so this is a tension, I walk all the time, and when I say, I think good, reasonable, biblical Christians can come to differing opinions on this, I mean it, man. And I practice what I preach, and I live alongside and serve alongside for 9 years, another Calvinist lead pastor. And one of the good things about it is, it forces you to be really honest and charitable about the other side, because he's one office down, and so if I say something that's not fair, I'm going to hear about it. Just like he's going to hear about it if he says something that's not fair. And, if God and God's infinite wisdom, I have to assume, could have made this matter like perfectly clear, right? The last book of the Bible could have been like, hey, in summary, here's what you're supposed to think about this, this, and this. And yet God and God's infinite wisdom decided not to do that. And so if that's, what God and his wisdom decided to do, then by golly, I have to be able to pastor a church even with one of those blasted Calvinists.
Well, I often refer to you in emails that I get, or messages on Facebook about, somebody working with a Calvinist on staff and asking, how do I deal with this? Is it even possible? And I'll often say, well, I have a friend. I don't usually mention your name, but I'll say I have a friend who actually does co-pastor with the Calvinist, and they are able to get along. And so it takes a special kind of Calvinist as well as a special kind of non-Calvinist probably to be able to make that work. But nevertheless, it is being accomplished, and that may be a demonstration of God's grace more than almost anything else that we could be aware of, because it does take grace for people who disagree with each other to be able to work together for the kingdom. And it's a reminder, I think, that this is a secondary issue, though it has primary issue consequences that I think do impact the way we worship and know God, and therefore I think it's important for us to discuss them. I think Calvinists would agree with that. DeYoung even talks about how he agrees that this is an important discussion to have, and I so appreciate the fact that you spoke into it. As we close, tell people how to get a hold of you. I've already put a link in the show notes to your site, Purple Theology, austinfisher.com. They can find you. Any other books coming out soon on this topic, or any other that we should know about?
I think I'm all written out on this particular topic. Now I just get to go talk about it, which is fun. No, Austin T. Fisher on Twitter. My church is Vista Community Church. You can always jump on there and see what we have going on, or listen to sermons or whatever. Working on another book. Right now it's probably about halfway done about, well, it's a proposal I have for working towards certainly systemic justice, which is a very important issue, but not neglecting what I would call systemic friendship in the search for systemic justice. And so I'm hopeful that it'll be helpful. You know how these books work. It'll probably be like 18 years before it's published or something, but it's on the horizon. Yeah.
Well, for those of you who are looking for a good author who addresses not only this topic, but other topics as well, I highly recommend Austin's work. And many of you have asked, where's a good preacher that I can go listen to or get their podcast from, who's not Calvinistic leaning. Well, there you go, right there. Austin Fischer is another good pastor that preaches on a regular basis and has tons of podcasts out there. I'm assuming they can find that at your local church, and you can download his messages there and listen to them on a regular basis. And so, Austin, thank you for your time today. I appreciate your work. God bless you, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me, Leighton.
God bless. Bye-bye.